Hello everyone, my name is Paulo Alves, and on this video we are going to create the form and the validation of that form of the login screen for our real delivery app using React Native. For this form validation, we are going to use the libraries of Formik and Yup. Subscribe to the channel if you want to follow this development, and let's take a look on what we are going to have by the end of this video. If I just click on the login button, we are going to see that both error messages are showing up. If I put an invalid email, you are going to see that the not a valid email error message shows up. If I put a valid email, then we see that no errors for the email field are going to be shown anymore. And if I put anything on the password field, we see that there are no errors anymore in our form. This is our login screen, and we can see that there is no validation in this screen. I can put anything in the email input field. The forgot email password button is always enabled, even though the email is not valid. And to fix this, we are going to use the Formik library, which will help us getting the values from the screen, validating them, show the errors, and submit the form. And we also are going to use the Yup library to define in an easier way how our form is going to behave. So let's go to the command line and install these libraries. To do this, I inform npm to install Formik and also Yup. So let's go to our login screen. Our login form consists on this part here, 2 input fields and 3 buttons. So let's put this inside of the Formik tag which we just installed. To Formik, we have to inform the initial values of our form. So I'm going to create an object that contains an empty email and an empty password. I also have to inform what's going to be executed when this form is submitted. So I'm just going to execute the login function that we created in our previous videos. Formik gives us a bunch of functions and attributes to make our lives easier with React Native. I can get those functions and attributes on the following way. I'm going to create a body inside of the Formik, and this body is going to receive some parameters inside of this function. I'm not going to add those parameters yet, and now let's add the body of our function. What this function does is to return the form. So let's cut it. Let's remember that the React Native components, they have to return only one component. So I'm going to create an empty component here, and I'm going to put the form inside of this empty component. All right, it's inside of this instruction of Formik that we get the access to the attributes and functions that Formik has. One of those functions is the handle submit, which is the function that will be executed when our form is submitted. So what submits our form is the login button. So I'm going to call the handle submit on the on press of the login button. So what happens now is that when I press the login button, I submit the form. And after submitting the form, I'm executing the login function, which will then execute the navigation to the home screen. All right, now we have the form created, but for now nothing new has happened. Just because I'm not informing anywhere how this form is going to behave. I didn't inform yet which fields are going to be mandatory and which one validates the email, for example. To do this, I have to inform that our form has a validation schema, and it's here where I'm going to let the form know which fields are mandatory and which fields are an email and so on. So it's in this part that we are going to use the Yup library. To do this, I like to create a separate file just to handle the form. I'm going to start by importing everything as Yup from the Yup library. After this, I'm going to export a constant called login form, and this constant is going to receive the form validation. To create this form validation, I will inform that Yup will validate an object that has this following shape. So I'll save this and let's just remove this error that's annoying me in the login screen.tsx file. Alright, we don't have the error anymore, so let's create the test on top of this form that we just created. To do this, I come to the test file and we are going to create the tests here. Let's first run the tests, so I'll inform npm to run the tests, and I'm going to inform it also that I only want to run the login.screen.test.js test, and also I'll inform that I want to run this test again every time I change this file. As I just created the form, our test starts to become asynchronous. I didn't do much, but you can see that we are having an error in this test that should go to the home page on login. So what I'm gonna do is simply to make this test asynchronous. And to do this, I put that async on the test function, and I'm gonna also inform that our test is gonna wait a few seconds before it's actually tested. This wait for instruction comes also from the test library, and that's exactly what it does. It keeps executing this expect until there is some timeout. If the spec was true, then the test will just pass. If the spec keeps being false for some 5 seconds, let's say, then the test is gonna fail. So let's save it, and we are gonna see that all tests will pass. So let's create our first test based on this form. I'm gonna test that the form should be invalid if the email is empty. So let's declare the values of the form that I'm gonna test. So I'm gonna create this constant called form values, and I'm gonna inform that email is empty. And now I'm gonna expect that the login form, when I check if it's valid in a synchronous way by passing the form values that I just declared, it has to be false. After I save this, the test is gonna run, and we are gonna see that it's gonna fail because for now our form is valid. So let's make this function return that our form is not valid because the email field is empty. To do this, I go back to the form file, and I will start creating the shape of our validation object. I'm going to inform that our form has an email, and that this email is going to be created as a string, and also that it is required. I'm going to also put here an error message in case the email is empty. So the email is required. After I save it, our test will now pass. But we will see that we are gonna have an error in another test. That will be this other test that we just fixed. But that doesn't happen because when I click on the login button, it's not submitted because the form is not valid. So let's just comment this test for now, and we'll get back to it later. Let's continue with the validation of our form. Now when I save it, all the tests will pass. So let's create our next test, and on this test the form should be invalid if the email is invalid. I'll create a constant with the form values, and I'll declare an invalid email to this constant. Now I expect that the login form, when it's validated in a synchronous way with the values that I just created, it will be false. After saving it, the test will fail because I didn't declare on the form that the email field is of the type email. So the form doesn't know it is invalid. So I can go to the form and inform that this field is an email. And when I have an email error, I mean when the email is not valid, I can have a message saying that the email is not valid. After I save it, now our test will pass. I also want to create another test that the form should be invalid if the password is empty. I'll create a constant that will simulate our form. This constant will have a property called password, which is empty, and also it has a valid email. I'll put here a valid email because otherwise we're gonna have an error on our form and we are gonna be expecting actually the wrong thing. So let's expect that on this login form, if I check if it's valid in a synchronous way with the form values that we just declared, I'll expect that this validation is false. After saving it, we're gonna have an error, so let's just go to the form and create a new field, which is a password field, and it will be created using Yup as a string, and it's gonna be required. The error message I'm gonna put here is password is required. After saving it, we are gonna see that now, yeah, our tests are gonna pass. Now let's create the next test, and this test should just verify if the form is valid. I'll create a constant with the values of our form, and these values are gonna be a valid password, and it also a valid email. Now expect that for this form, if I call the isValid function with the values that I just created, this form is going to return true. I mean, this form is going to be valid. After saving it, we are going to see that our test is going to pass. If we go to the app, we are going to see that no validation message is being shown to the user. But if I click on the login button, we are going to see that now we are not redirected to the home screen. This happens because the form is not valid. By not being valid, the handle submit function of Formik is not being called. By not being called, the login function is not being called, and then we are not redirecting the user to the home screen. But even if I put a valid email actually, and I put some password on this field, we realize that even if I click on the login button, we are not redirected to the home screen. That happens because I'm not updating the form values with the values that are inside of the input fields. I mean, the value of the email field is not going inside of that object that we just created here in the Formik. Right here, those values are not being updated, let's say. To do this update, Formik gives us a function called handle change, which will do exactly this, update the form values based on the input values. So on the email field, I can inform that on change its text, the handle change function is going to be executed, and it's being executed for the email input field. I'm going to do the same thing for the password field. When I change it, I'm going to execute the handle change Formik function, and I'm going to inform that it's being executed for the password field. I'll save it, and let's see how this changed the app in our emulator. I'll click on login with an empty form, and we are going to see that we are not going to the home screen. If I inform a valid email and also a valid password, we'll see that now, yes, when I click on the login button, we are being redirected to the home screen. And that's exactly what I wanted. I mean, almost, because now what we need to do is show an error message, a validation error message, in case the value that we just informed is not valid. It could be like a red error message just below the field, informing which problem that field has. So let's go back to the code and do that. But before that, let's uncomment that test and let's make it pass. We see now that it's failing. To make it pass, I need a valid form. And to have a valid form, I have to inform the email and password fields. So let's already create the test IDs to our email and password field. For the email, it's going to be email, simple. And for the password, it's going to be password. Now I can already reference those fields on my tests. So I can come to my test and create a constant called email, and I'll get that email input by the ID using the email ID. I'm also going to create a password constant and do something really similar to what we just did, but for the password field. What I have to do now is to fire an event to change the text on the email field, and I'll inform a valid email. And for the password field, I'm going to put a password field, which can actually be anything. After saving it, we'll see that now our test is passing. And just to remind you, this function here is asynchronous. I mean, if we didn't have this wait for, what would happen is that the test would run, and this part here would be executed just after the test had finished already. So we would have an error. With this wait for function, the test is waiting some seconds until it runs the expect instruction. So now, yeah, let's show the validation error messages for our form, for the fields of our form. And it should show an error message if the email has been touched and the email is empty. Let's just inform that this test is asynchronous, and I'm gonna get a reference of the page using the render function with the login screen. Now create a constant for the email from the page by ID using the email ID. Now I will fire an event that will change the text of our email field. So let's get a reference to the login button from the screen by using the login button test ID. And now I'm gonna fire an event to press that button. I'm doing this just to guarantee that the email field is being touched. And now wait for those asynchronous calls to happen. And when it happens, I'm going to try to get by the test ID the error for that email. I'll save it, and obviously this is going to fail because this error email doesn't exist yet. So let's go to our screen and create this error element. First, I need to reference a property of Formik that contains all the errors of the form. And now here for the email field, I use the text component that exists on the React Native paper. And I'll define that its test ID will be error email. I'm also going to define that its style is an object that has the color white, but has the background color red, so it's really visible. And I'm going to put as the body of this component the email error message. I'll save it. I'm going to go to the emulator and you're going to be able to see that the component that I just created is always being shown but without any message. But if I click on the email field and I type something, then we are going to see that the invalid email message is being shown. If I make this field empty, the email is required shows up. If I put a valid email, then no message is being shown. But the component is still there, as we can see. So what we need to do here is to guarantee that the error message is going to show up for fields that have been touched, and also it's going to show up only if there is an error message showing up. Here I'm expecting that the error message should be shown if the email has been touched and if the field is empty. So it is empty and also it has been touched. So this test is all right. So let's go to our next test. I'm going to test that it should hide the error message if the email has not been touched. I'm going to create a constant that is our page, and I'm going to instantiate this constant by rendering the login screen. I also have to declare that this test is asynchronous, and now I can execute it in an asynchronous way, waiting for that. I will expect that for this page, when I query all the fields by test ID with the error email, then I'm going to verify that the amount of these elements that were found by this query are equal to 0. After I save this, we are going to have an error because the error email component is always being shown. So let's make this test pass. Formik has another function to help us, and this function is the setFieldTouched. For the email field, I'll inform that when the user focuses on that field, I will execute a function and that function will set the email field as touched. And in order to know which fields of our form have been touched, we can use the property touched. Now I can simply verify if the email field has been touched before showing that email error. So I'm going to create here a ternary using the touched attribute, and I'm going to verify if the email has been touched. In case it has been touched, then what I'm going to do is to show the error email component. In case it hasn't been touched, then I'm just going to return no. After I save it, we are going to see that our test will pass. Now let's see it on the screen. So if I click on the login button, we'll see that the email is required is showing up. If I enter the email field and I type something, we are going to have the invalid email error. If I put a valid email, we are going to see that the message is not showing up anymore. But the field is still showing up. So we should show the error only if there is an error to show. You can see here on the code that I'm just verifying if the field has been touched in order to show the error component. I also have to verify if there is any error on this field in order to show the error message. I'll save it. Let's go back to the emulator and check if everything is correct. If I click on the field, we are going to see the email is required message. If I type something, we are going to see the not a valid email message. And if I put a valid email, the error component disappears. So let's do the same thing for the password field, because for now it doesn't have anything. So I can do just almost the same thing that I did for the email field. So let's copy this part here. Actually, for the password field, we already have half of it, so I'm just gonna copy the bottom part, and I'm gonna change from email to password. I'm also gonna copy this part that shows the error message, and I'm gonna change from email to password. Let's actually do our test first. I'm not gonna save that change that I just made. I'm gonna copy these two tests, and I'm just gonna change from email to password everywhere I need. I'll save it, and we'll see that our test will fail. Now let's go back to the login screen file. I'll save this and we'll see that our test now, will pass. So now let's go to our emulator and test this. If I just click on the login button, we are gonna see that both error messages are showing up. If I put an invalid email, you are gonna see that the not a valid email error message shows up. If I put a valid email, then we see that no errors for the email field are gonna be shown anymore. And if I put anything on the password field, we see that there are no errors anymore in our form. Only one thing is missing here. This forgot email password button should only be enabled if the email is a valid email. So let's finish this video with this. On this test, I will verify that it should disable the recovery password button if the email is empty. So let's create a reference to our page. Now I'm gonna create a reference to the recovery button. And now I'm gonna wait for an asynchronous call, and I will expect that for that recovery button on its property, and more specifically on the accessibility state property, the disabled value should be true. Let's now define this test ID for our forgot email/password button. Now save it, and you'll see that we have an error because I'm not disabling the button. To inform that the button should be disabled when we have an empty mail, I'm gonna get another property of Formik that contains the values of the form. So I'll come to the forgot email password button, and I'll inform in the disabled property that it will be disabled in case the email is empty. After saving it, we are gonna see that our test will pass. Actually not, because this test should be asynchronous and it's not yet. Now yeah, it's gonna pass. Now I also have to disable the button if the email has any error. So let's create a test for that. It should disable the recovery button if the email has errors. I will put this function as asynchronous. I'll copy this test to make it easier. I'll now get the email field from our page by its test ID, and I'll fire the event to change the text of the email input field to an invalid email. After saving it, we're gonna have an error on our test because the email is not empty, but it has an error. So I have to go back to the screen and inform that the disabled property now will also verify if there are errors on this email. If yes, true, if not, false. After saving it, we'll see that our test will pass. And now let's verify this really quick on the emulator. When I enter the page, the button is not enabled. If I have an error on the email field, the button will continue being disabled. And if I put a valid email, the button will be enabled. And that was it for today. On the next video, we are going to go deeper on the flow of our login screen by starting the state management of that login screen. And for that, we are going to use the idea of Redux. So our login screen is just going to react to the state that we have on the Redux. So subscribe to the channel in case you're not subscribed, but you want to follow the development of this real app using React Native. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, share the video with your friends, and see you on the next video.